April 18, 1942, just past noon over Tokyo, a B-25 bomber roars across the Japanese capital at rooftop height, the first American aircraft to strike Japan in the Second World War. In the co-pilot's seat sits a 26-year-old lieutenant named Richard Cole. The pilot beside him is Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, the most famous aviator in America, the man whose name the raid will carry forever. Cole's job is simple and nearly impossible: help keep the most important pilot of the war alive long enough to drop his bombs and reach China. 16 bombers launched that morning. None had ever taken off from a carrier before. Richard Cole was an ordinary young man from Dayton, Ohio, who had grown up watching airplanes at the local field and dreaming of flight. He joined the Army Air Corps, earned his wings, and volunteered for a secret mission he was told only was extremely hazardous. He did not know the target. He did not know he would be flying off an aircraft carrier. He did not know his pilot would be Jimmy Doolittle himself. When the volunteers finally learned the plan, bomb Tokyo, then try to reach China, not one of them backed out. By chance and by nerve, Cole found himself in the right-hand seat of the lead airplane. But to understand why Richard Cole would spend the next 77 years as the keeper of this mission's memory, and why he would be the very last of the 80 men to carry it, we have to go back to why the raid was flown at all. In the spring of 1942, America was losing. Pearl Harbor was still smoking. The Philippines were falling. The country needed, desperately, to hit back, to prove that Japan itself could be reached. The Doolittle raid was that proof. It was never really about the bombs. It was about the message, and 80 volunteers agreed to carry it, most of them expecting to die doing it. The plan was to launch the 16 bombers from the carrier USS Hornet within 400 miles of Japan, strike Tokyo and other cities, and fly on to friendly airfields in China. But on the morning of April 18th, the task force was spotted by a Japanese picket boat far short of the launch point. Doolittle and the Hornet's captain made the call to launch immediately, more than 600 miles out, with no fuel margin to spare. Doolittle's bomber went first, lumbering off the pitching deck with feet to spare. Cole was beside him. 15 more followed. Every one of them got airborne. Now they had to cross an ocean of enemy sky and somehow reach China. Doolittle's crew crossed the Japanese coast low and climbed just enough to drop their incendiary bombs on Tokyo. Anti-aircraft fire came up around them and fighters rose to meet the raid. But the Japanese were stunned. They had believed the home islands were untouchable, and now American bombers were over the capital in daylight. The 16 aircraft struck Tokyo and several other cities and turned southwest toward China, low on fuel, flying into worsening weather and a coming night. From the right seat, Cole watched the fuel gauges fall. The raid had worked. Getting home was now the harder mission, and the odds were turning against them with every mile. The flight to China became a slow emergency. Headwinds had eaten the fuel from the start, and the early launch had stolen the margin they needed. As darkness fell and a storm closed in, the crews realized none of them would reach the airfields waiting for them. The choice narrowed to two grim options: bail out into the black over unknown country, or ditch in the sea. Doolittle's crew flew on through the storm until the gauges read empty. Over the mountains of eastern China, in darkness and driving rain, Doolittle gave the order every man had hoped to avoid: bail out. Cole clipped on his parachute, moved to the hatch, and jumped into the storm. Richard Cole fell through the dark and the rain, his parachute snapping open above him. He could see nothing below. Mountains, a river, a Japanese patrol, he had no way to know. When he finally hit, he came to rest hanging in a tree on a mountainside, his canopy snagged in the branches, suspended above ground he could not see. He spent what was left of the night there, soaked and alone, somewhere in occupied China, not knowing whether the people who found him at dawn would be friends or enemies. In the morning he cut himself down, and then the second half of the Doolittle raid story began, the part that depended entirely on the Chinese. What happened to the raiders on the ground in China is the part the celebration never dwelled on. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe. We are just getting to it. Richard Cole, like most of the raiders who came down over China, was found by Chinese villagers and soldiers who guided him to safety, hiding him, feeding him, moving him west, away from Japanese forces. Doolittle's entire crew survived and was reunited. Most of the 80 raiders made it out the same way, carried and sheltered by Chinese people who risked everything to do it. But that help would bring down on those villages a punishment so savage it is still hard to put into words. In the months after the raid, Japanese forces swept through the regions of China where the raiders had come down, hunting the people who had helped them. The reprisals were systematic and merciless. Villages were burned. Civilians were killed in staggering numbers. Historians estimate that around 250,000 Chinese people died in the campaign of retaliation that followed the Doolittle raid. Then the men who bombed Tokyo flew away. The people who saved them paid a price almost beyond counting. Richard Cole carried that knowledge for the rest of his long life. The raid that made 80 Americans into heroes had a cost that fell terribly on others. In purely military terms, the Doolittle raid did little damage to Japan. A few buildings, some fires soon put out, but its effect on the war was enormous, and it lay entirely in the mind. In America, it was the first good news of the Pacific War, proof the enemy could be hit. In Japan, it was a humiliation that the homeland had been bombed, and it pushed the Japanese command toward the overreaching gamble that would end, 2 months later, in catastrophe at Midway. 16 bombers and 80 men had changed the shape of the war. Richard Cole had been in the first seat of the first plane, and he still had a whole war left to fight. After China, Richard Cole did not go home to a quiet hero's life. He stayed in the China-Burma-India theater and kept flying. He flew the Hump, the airlift route over the Himalayas, the highest and most dangerous sustained airlift of the war, hauling supplies from India into China over mountains that killed crews by the hundreds. Later he flew with the 1st Air Commando Group in Burma, supporting operations behind Japanese lines. The co-pilot from the Tokyo raid spent years more in some of the hardest flying of the war, far from the headlines, doing the unglamorous and lethal work of keeping the war in Asia alive. When the war finally ended, Richard Cole did what so many of his generation did. He went home and built an ordinary life. He settled in the hill country of Texas, near the town of Comfort, and became a citrus and cattle farmer. He married, raised 5 children, and lived quietly, decade after decade, on the land. He did not present himself as a hero. To his neighbors, he was a farmer who happened to have done something extraordinary once, long ago, in the right-hand seat of an airplane over Tokyo. But the bond among the 80 raiders never faded, and once a year it called them back together. The Doolittle Raiders held a reunion almost every year, and at the center of it stood a set of 80 silver goblets, one for each man, each name engraved twice, once upright and once upside down. At each reunion, in a solemn private ceremony, the survivors read the names aloud, and the goblets of the raiders who had died that year were turned upside down. A bottle of fine cognac from 1896, the year of Doolittle's birth, was kept for one purpose. The last 2 living raiders would one day open it and drink a final toast to all the men gone before. Year by year the goblets turned over. The circle of the living grew smaller. Jimmy Doolittle himself died in 1993. At the age of 96, his Medal of Honor and his place in history secure. One by one, the other raiders followed. The pilots, the bombardiers, the gunners, the men who had come down over China together. The reunions grew quieter. The number of upright goblets dwindled to a handful, then to a few, then to 2, and the man who had sat beside Doolittle in the lead plane on the first day of it all, Richard Cole, found himself becoming what none of them had ever expected one man to be, the last one left. In November of 2013, with only a few raiders still living and too frail to wait any longer, the survivors held their final toast. The 1896 cognac was opened at last. The few remaining men, Richard Cole among them, drank to the 79 comrades who had gone before. It was the ceremony they had promised one another for 70 years. After that, the others passed until Cole alone remained, the last of the 80 men who had bombed Tokyo in April 1942. He carried that role the way he had carried the co-pilot's seat, quietly, without complaint, and with a steady sense of duty to the men no longer there to speak for themselves. Richard Cole died on April 9, 2019, in San Antonio, Texas. He was 103 years old. He was the last living Doolittle Raider, and with him passed the final direct memory of the mission that had told a frightened America, in its darkest spring, that the war could be won. He was buried with military honors. The 80 silver goblets are kept today at the National Museum of the United States Air Force near Dayton, Ohio, Cole's own hometown, where visitors can still see them. Every name engraved twice, the whole circle now turned over at last. The Doolittle raid is remembered as one of the most daring operations of the war, and it was. But the last survivor's lifetime forces an honest question. The raid did almost no military damage. Its value was a message, and its cost, in Japanese reprisals, fell on 250,000 Chinese civilians who had done nothing but help downed Americans. It was a mission whose main effect was a morale boost worth that price. The raiders never pretended it was simple. Cole spoke of the Chinese who saved him with lasting gratitude and sorrow all his life. He believed the mission mattered. He also never forgot what it had cost the people on the ground. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole died on April 9, 2019, at 103. The last of the Doolittle Raiders. He is remembered as the co-pilot who sat beside Jimmy Doolittle over Tokyo, but he was far more: a Hump pilot, an air commando, a Texas farmer, a father of 5, and for his final years the lone keeper of 80 men's memory. The young lieutenant who hung in a tree in a Chinese storm and lived to be the last one standing. The man in the right-hand seat of the first plane. The raider who turned over the last goblet and carried all the others with him to the end. If your father, your grandfather, your uncle, anyone in your family served with the Doolittle Raiders, flew the Hump over the Himalayas, served in the China-Burma-India theater, or anywhere in the Army Air Forces of the Second World War, leave their name and what they did in the comments below. Don't just leave the name. Tell us one thing about them. One thing they did, one thing they said, one thing you remember. The men who were there deserve more than a name in a database. They deserve to be remembered as people. Subscribe if you want the next story. There are more of them.